Lindsay, will you let me know when everyone's in, please?
I think there'll be stragglers for a couple of minutes, but as of right now, we have 87 participants.
Okay. And it's about 6 after 6, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Just a quick welcome to everybody. Good evening, and thank you for being here with us on this Thursday evening. We appreciate your time and you joining us for our draft alternatives virtual workshop for General Plan 2040. We have a brief presentation for you. Joanna Jansen from PlaceWorks, our consultant who's helping us with our general plan, will be starting us out, and then she will explain our agenda and the game plan for this evening. So with that, thanks again for being here, and I will hand it off to Joanna.
Thank you so much, Christina. As Christina said, my name is Joanna Jansen. I'm a principal with PlaceWorks. We're the consultant leading the General Plan Update consultant team. First thing is to let you know that we have both Spanish and Mandarin translation available tonight, and I'll ask our translators to make a brief announcement about that.
Muy buenas noches a todos, soy José Luis Fernández, uno de los intérpretes al español. Gracias por estar aquí con nosotros. Solo para avisarles nuevamente, esta presentación tiene servicio de interpretación. Para empezar esta función, en unos momentos van a encender la función de interpretación y lo único que tienen que hacer es hacer clic en el icono de interpretación, que es o un globo o un menú de 3 puntos suspensivos. Una vez hagan clic ahí, seleccionan español como en su idioma.
各位好，今天晚上欢迎大家来参加 San Mateo 我们这市中心的一个研讨会。那我们今天晚上是由这个市政府还有 Breakout 的一些的他是我们的一些顾问来关于这个市政前面要做的事情跟大家有一些引导。那有西班牙话跟那个普通话国语的一个翻译，那等等我们会告诉大家怎么样来转到这个翻译的频道，让你可以听到国语的翻译。好，谢谢。
Great, thank you to our interpreters. And for those of you, if you need interpretation, the globe has appeared at the bottom of the screen. You can click there and access those services. With that, I'm going to share my screen and begin the presentation. We have a relatively brief presentation for you tonight, just going over a little bit about where we are. And let's see here. We've done welcome and introductions. I have about a 15-minute presentation, and then we're going to have a little bit of time for clarifying questions and answers that you might have about this presentation or about this process. Then the majority of our time from about 6:45 until 8:25 tonight is going to be spent in breakout rooms, where you will have the opportunity to discuss the alternatives that we're here tonight to review in more detail and provide ideas about the range of alternatives. And then we're going to come back together very briefly for a few minutes before 8:30 to wrap up and adjourn. So our goals today are to provide an inclusive and informed dialogue about potential future changes in San Mateo, to develop a shared sense of possibility for the future, to review and comment on the range of draft land use and circulation alternatives, and to understand that this is just one step and one source of input into a larger and longer process. First, what is the general plan? The general plan is a very powerful and important document because it guides future growth and development decisions. Its chapters or elements cover land use and transportation in the city, as well as urban design, open space conservation, safety, and other very critical issues. The general plan sets the overarching direction for the city, and then this direction is further implemented through specific plans, which are more detailed plans for each part of the city. and then the zoning code, which regulates how buildings, landscaping, parking, and other features are developed on individual sites. So the general plan is not the same as the zoning code, but the zoning code is a very important tool for translating the vision and ideas of the general plan into buildings. The general plan is guided by a vision statement and values that were developed with extensive community input. This general plan is intended to guide San Mateo towards being a vibrant, livable, diverse, and healthy community that respects the quality of its neighborhoods, fosters a flourishing economy, is committed to equity, and is a leader in environmental sustainability. That vision is supported by values of diversity, balance, inclusivity, prosperity, and resiliency. This is the vision and values that the general plan should embody and uphold. Let's look at where we are now and what's next. This timeline shows two important and related projects that are happening now, right now in San Mateo. One of them is the general plan. That's what we're talking about tonight. So with the general plan, right now we're in the step of finalizing draft alternatives. And then in the second half of 2021, we're going to begin the process of evaluating those alternatives and creating a preferred scenario based on additional community input. Then over the course of 2022, we will turn that preferred scenario in the draft goals and policies into a draft general plan, which will be accompanied by an environmental impact report. Right now, we're looking towards adoption of the general plan in late 2023. So we still have over 2 years of your input into this process, and we will take each step very deliberately. The other project shown on this timeline in green is the housing element. The housing element is a required section of the general plan that provides policies and programs to ensure that San Mateo can accommodate housing for all members of the community at all income levels. Although the housing element is a legally required part of the general plan, the two projects are proceeding on separate but parallel tracks to ensure that the housing element meets state-imposed deadlines for adoption by the end of 2022. We're doing a lot of careful collaboration and coordination between these two projects to make sure that they remain consistent. Now, who gets to participate in these foundational decision-making processes in San Mateo? The entire community gets to participate in the general plan. The general plan is an opportunity to understand who's in our community and to build and strengthen that community and enable all of us to solve problems together. San Mateo includes many different kinds of stakeholders who all have an interest in the general plan update. That includes people who live here, whether they rent or own, people who work here, people who own businesses here, people who own property here, people who build projects here. Everyone who lives, works, or plays here is a stakeholder in the general plan process. And we understand that to be successful, it is vital that the general plan reflect the many voices in San Mateo. So that's why over the past 3 years, since the general plan started back in 2018, we have worked very hard to meet people where they are, not only through community workshops like this one, but also through many different methods of communication, going out into the community at pop-up events, meeting people through intercept surveys, offering online exercise, working with the school districts and local faith-based organizations, including meetings in Spanish and other languages. Last month, we did a citywide mailing to every address in San Mateo and to remind folks about where we are in this process and let them know about this and other recent workshops. Through these efforts so far, we have had interactions with over 3,000 individuals, and we've accumulated over 4,000 comments that have shaped each step of our process. Some consistent themes have emerged in that community feedback. Many people in San Mateo are concerned about traffic congestion and safety on the roadways, as well as the lack of affordable housing in the community. The need for transit improvements and improvements to sidewalks, crosswalks, and street lighting to make walking safe. We've heard that people are concerned about being able to find convenient parking and really want to see San Mateo continue to acknowledge and make space for the important role of community events, activities, and parks in supporting a vibrant community life in San Mateo. So the three alternatives that we're looking at tonight reflect a range of different possible ideas that all respond to these themes that we've heard so far. Let's turn specifically to the alternatives process. The alternatives process is so important because it's how we guide decisions about changes to the land use map and the circulation or transportation system. As you heard earlier, the general plan land use map provides the overall guidance for what can be built where, and it sets the groundwork for the regulations in the zoning code and other documents that determine how San Mateo will look and feel. Every parcel of property in San Mateo has a color on the general plan land use map. The map on this slide is the existing general plan land use map that's in place today. The color on this map determines what can and can't be built on that property. So this map is very important, and the land use alternatives are our tool for exploring and evaluating potential changes to this map before any decisions are made. When we entered shelter in place back in March 2020, the general plan update was in the midst of a series of community workshops and public meetings to identify the range of land use and circulation alternatives. We started by choosing study areas, identifying where we want to focus our consideration of these potential changes. The study areas are the places in San Mateo that are most likely to change and/or best able to accommodate change because of their access to transportation, services, and infrastructure. After lots of community input over the summer and fall of 2019, the City Council gave direction on 10 study areas. And then with further community input in the fall and winter of 2019, we created a range of alternatives for each study area. So that led us up to the spring of 2020, right before the pandemic. We took 3 draft alternatives, A, B, and C, back to the community for review at an open house. And then COVID hit, and we paused public meetings for the general plan update. In January 2021 of this year, just a couple months ago, we went back to the City Council to confirm that the 3 alternatives remain valid and to restart the community input process. So that's what we're doing tonight. The next step after this will be an evaluation that compares the 3 alternatives, and I'll say more about that evaluation on the next slide. Based on that evaluation, we're then going to work through a series of community meetings, general plan subcommittee, planning commission, city council meetings to formulate a preferred scenario based on mixing and matching pieces from the alternatives to become the basis for revisions to the general plan land use map and the future transportation network. At each step in the alternatives process so far, we've been going through a round of community input, general plan subcommittee input, planning commission input, and city council review and direction. And we anticipate that that will continue throughout this process. So I mentioned the land use alternatives evaluation. Once we finalize the range of 3 alternatives to evaluate, then we're going to do this evaluation that will consider a number of topics that are very important to San Mateo stakeholders, including the topics that are listed on this slide. This evaluation will shed significant light on the pros and cons of each alternative. We are not choosing among the alternatives tonight. That process will begin after the alternatives have been evaluated, and we share that evaluation with the community. No decision on the preferred land use scenario will be made until the until the evaluation is complete. So we're here tonight to get your input on whether this is the right range of alternatives for us to evaluate. The steps of debating the pros and cons of these alternatives, the step of choosing among the alternatives, the step of mixing and matching the best of each one of these alternatives, all of that will come in the next stage of the process. Tonight, we want to know whether or not we've got the right range for study. Are there ideas that we're missing that you want to see reflected in at least one of the alternatives? So these maps show the 3 alternatives, A, B, and C, side by side. Don't worry, I know you can't read these at this scale, that's okay. Your facilitator is going to walk you through each one of these maps at a much higher level of detail when we move into the breakout rooms. I just want to show you kind of how these maps look citywide, built based around those 10 study areas that we talked about that were approved by the City Council. those are the colored areas on this map. And areas outside of those 10 study areas are covered by the general plan, and they can and will see some change over the next 20 years. So for example, significant recent changes in state law have made it much easier to build accessory dwelling units or ADUs or in-law units. And we expect to see many more ADUs being built in single family neighborhoods. So that's one example of the way things might change outside of these study areas. But we think study areas are likely to see the greatest amount of change. Within those 10 study areas, the alternatives explore different possible land use categories, and those land use categories translate into different potential amounts of residential growth. So this table shows you how that looks in the numbers. Alternative A includes about 10,900 new homes within the 20-year life of the general plan. Alternative B includes about 15,800 new homes. And alternative C includes about 20,800 new homes over that 20-year time span. You can see in the bottom row that all three of the alternatives include about the same number of jobs, around 15,000 new jobs. We did ask our economist on our general plan team to reconsider these potential changes in housing and employment patterns as a result of COVID. We do still feel that over the 20-year life of the general plan, these numbers are valid benchmarks for us to consider for the range of possible futures for San Mateo. So I also do want to touch on questions about Measure Y up front. Measure Y was passed by voters in November 2020. It extended height and density limits on new residential development, and it has a sunset date of 2030. This general plan looks out beyond that sunset date to the year 2040, and it does include some ideas that would explore land use designations that would allow buildings with 6 or more stories, especially in study areas 3 and 4 near the Caltrain stations. If the community and the decision makers together, going through the process I outlined a minute ago, craft a preferred land use scenario that includes heights and densities that are above what is currently allowed by Measure Y, then the city would need to ask voters to approve these changes in order to implement those components of the general plan before Measure Y sunsets. We also have 3 possible circulation alternatives that we're going to be asking for your feedback on tonight. These are not broken down by study area because we really want to look at the city's transportation network holistically as a citywide system. All of the alternatives assume pedestrian and bicycle improvements that are consistent with existing adopted city plans. And any of these 3 alternatives can be tailored to fit the preferred land use scenario that is developed through the process. Very briefly, alternative A prioritizes pedestrian corridors, pedestrian improvements to challenging intersections, and implementing traffic calming and safety improvements near highway on-ramps. This alternative also includes a feature of a 2-block pedestrian-only street in downtown San Mateo. Alternative B, circulation alternative B, focuses on increasing and improving transit access to and from major connections in San Mateo. So it would add new east-west transit connections to the Hillsdale Caltrain station. It would add prioritized high occupancy vehicle and bus lanes, and add bus rapid transit on El Camino. And alternative C would create a pedestrian-focused car light space in downtown. This alternative also explores some emerging technology, such as an automated micro-mobility circulator, like a shuttle that might be an autonomous vehicle within city limits. So that's a quick overview of the circulation alternatives. Again, your facilitator is going to walk you through those in much more detail. So let's talk a little bit about what's going to happen in the breakout rooms when we send you there for a deeper dive into the alternatives. Just remember, where we are tonight is to get your take on whether this is the right range of alternatives and any ideas that you would like to see that aren't captured in at least one of the alternatives so that it can be included in our evaluation in the next step. So you'll be in one of these 5 breakout rooms. Our Spanish speakers will be in breakout room E, and they'll cover all 10 study areas and the 3 circulation alternatives with Spanish-speaking facilitators and note takers. All other facilitators, you're going to be moved to one of the other 4 breakout rooms. Don't worry, you don't have to memorize this schedule. In fact, you don't have to do anything. You're going to be put in your breakout room, and then teams of facilitators and note takers will join you to walk you through groups of the study areas and the circulation alternatives. So by the end of 4 rotations, you will have been visited by facilitators who can take you through a discussion of each one of the 10 study areas, as well as the 3 circulation alternatives. You're going to have a note taker as well, who's going to be capturing the ideas and feedback that are shared, and other supporters in your breakout room to help manage the chat and make sure that you're being heard and your feedback is being captured. So this just gives you kind of a sense of what's going to happen once we get into the breakout rooms. Let me touch on some of the materials that you're going to see in your breakout room. Your facilitator will be responsible for showing you all the materials you need for your discussion. They're going to use screen share. So when the breakout rooms start in just a few minutes, it'll be easiest to participate and understand if you're able to look at the screen and see what's being shared. You will look at a draft alternatives map for each one of the study areas as an example of the land use alternatives, and maps for the circulation alternatives that look like the ones I was sharing on the slides a few minutes ago. We also have something called a place type menu that has words and pictures to explain what kinds of development might happen corresponding to each one of the colors used on the land use alternatives maps. I know we have a lot of material to cover tonight, believe me, I know. You do have access to all of the maps and the materials that your facilitator is sharing. I do encourage you to follow along by looking at his or her screen so that everybody in the breakout room is kind of looking at the same thing at the same time. But if you want to refer to any of these meeting materials during the breakout rooms or after tonight, all of the materials are available online right now. You can access them either through the same email where you got the link to join this meeting, or on the strivesanmateo.org website under workshops and pop-up events. And you can look at them at your own pace. And one other comment that I want to make sure you're aware of is that if you have additional ideas about the range of alternatives, or if you have friends and neighbors who can't be here tonight and want to offer input, we also have an online survey at strivesanmateo.org, and it will walk you through each one of the individual study areas. You don't have to fill out each study area. You can just go there and offer comments on one if that's what you want to do. But it has all 10 study areas as well as the circulation alternatives, and you can offer your ideas and feedback on the range of alternatives through this online survey at your own pace. It's live right now, and it's going to be up through May 2nd. And again, that's at the website. If you go to strivesanmateo.org right now, this is the landing page, and you can click on that yellow button to take the survey. So if you feel like you have more ideas than you have a chance to share in the breakout rooms tonight, don't worry. We have this here for you to do at your convenience. So before we wrap up and before we turn to questions, I do just want to offer these guidelines for successful kind of conversations in the breakout rooms. First of all, let me express again how grateful we are to you for sharing your Thursday evening with us. We want everyone who's part of this meeting to feel welcome and respected and included. So we're offering these guidelines for your interactions in the breakout rooms. We're going to be interacting mostly through chat, but you will have the opportunity to raise your hand and offer a verbal comment as well. And don't forget, if you have additional ideas, we have the survey or the exercise for you available online. With that, it's time for your questions. I just shared a lot of information, and I want to clarify anything that you have questions about. We want to make sure we answer your questions about the general plan, questions about the alternatives process, questions about what we're doing here tonight, so that we can all move forward with a shared understanding. So we're going to use the chat function for you to submit your questions. What you want to do is use the little chat button at the bottom of your screen to access the chat window. And then please chat, send your questions to the person that's named Project Questions. That's Carrie. Carrie Stone is with Placework. She's our project manager on the general plan update. And she's going to help make sure that we're keeping track of all these questions as they come in. So please don't send them to me. Please send them to Project Questions. We tried to make it as clear as possible who's the right person to receive your questions. She's going to read us your question so that we can respond. And while we do that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing.
So Joanna, I'm going to start with a couple process questions we received.
Great.
Will the questions from the breakout rooms be combined and posted on the general plan website? If so, when and where? We
are definitely the recordings from this meeting, including the breakout rooms, available on the website, as well as a meeting summary.
And another process question, how does the selection of the general, can the survey be extended beyond May 2nd? My church located in North Central just learned of the survey.
We're happy to consider that. The reason we set May 2nd is because we do have a general plan subcommittee meeting coming up on May 18th for the general plan subcommittee to consider the public input that we've received so far. And don't worry if you just learned about the survey, it actually just went live today, so you're not at all behind. But certainly as that day gets closer, if we're hearing that folks need more time, we're happy to consider that.
All right. What is the definition of additional homes? Single family only?
Homes are any housing unit. Single family homes, apartments, accessory dwelling units, where people live.
Can you quickly describe circulation alternatives?
I can go back to those slides, but I think what probably is going to be most productive to you, since I did attempt to quickly describe the circulation alternatives, and it sounds like maybe that didn't quite get you all the way there, is to wait for that discussion in the breakout room, because one of the teams of facilitators and note takers is specifically trained in and expert in the circulation alternatives, and they're going to explain them in much more depth when you discuss them.
The next question, I don't understand what it means to define an area as one type of development when another type exists already. Are the existing buildings going to be torn down?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, some buildings will change over the next 20 years. Some buildings that are in place today will change, and you kind of see this change already happening in San Mateo. The alternatives place designations on every parcel, but it doesn't mean that every parcel is going to change in the next 20 years. Some might and some might not. But what we're asking is, if this parcel is going to change, what would we want it to be in the future? The general plan, the designation on the general plan does not force change to happen, but it says when change happens, what it should be the nature of that change. And I would also note that if you look carefully at the alternatives, you'll notice that many of the parcels are actually the same across all three alternatives. And that's because there are some parcels, for example, where there might be a project under construction right now, or maybe one's been approved and it hasn't started construction yet. Places like that, or places where the buildings are relatively new and we don't think they're likely to change in the next 20 years, those might retain their existing designation, or the designation might be the same across all three alternatives to indicate that those buildings probably will still be in place 20 years from now.
Great. What do we do if we want to support or discuss does not fit in the range? For example, in mid, 7 stories is not the same as 4 stories. Can we support the one and not the other?
I think this is asking a question about a place type where the range of allowed development within that one category goes all the way from 4 stories to 7 stories. And someone might feel comfortable with 4 stories, but might not feel comfortable with 7 stories. So I do understand that. Please provide us with your input, even though the category as it currently exists doesn't make a distinction between those heights. We still want to hear from you.
How did the alternatives come up with a minimum growth of about 33,000 people in the next 20 years, when San Mateo has grown from 77,000 to 104,000 over the last 40 years?
Sure. One important benchmark that we used in coming up with the range of population growth that we want to try to accommodate in this general plan update is thinking about what we know about projected housing needs. An important source of that information is the housing allocations that the city receives from the state via ABAG, the Association for Bay Area Governments. And that's the number of units that's going to need to be accommodated in the housing element that I mentioned that's already underway right now. So in that housing element, which as I mentioned has to be adopted no later than January 2023, the city expects to need to find room for and have policies and programs that support up to over 7,000 new units. So that's a big chunk of those new units right there. And the housing element needs to be a roadmap for accommodating those units, even within the next 8 years. Housing elements are updated on an 8-year cycle. So if in 8 years we're supposed to accommodate over 7,000 units, we think that 10,000 units is kind of a reasonable floor for the general plan that looks out for 20 years. There have been and will continue to be a series of meetings on the housing element, and those will go into much, much greater detail about the topic that I just touched on.
A question about what do 3 alternatives mean for the city? Does that also mean that there's 3 alternatives for each study area?
Right, so there are 3 alternatives for each study area. And we did try to think about the alternatives kind of in a way that makes sense citywide. So, you know, alternative A, as you saw, has the lowest residential growth and therefore tends to have, for example, the lower heights and lower densities across all 10 study areas. Whereas alternative C has the highest amount of residential growth, tends to have higher heights and higher densities across the 10 study areas. When we get to the point of making the, working together to make the preferred scenario, we'll be able to pick bits and pieces from different alternatives, from different study areas, and put them together in a new and different way to create the preferred alternative. So we don't have to pick one single citywide alternative out of the 3 that are developed so far.
All right, will participants identify what kind of stakeholder they are? A resident, property owner, developer, lobbyist, business owner? Each has a different perspective that should be identified.
Sure, so what we're gonna ask is when we get into the breakout rooms, if you do wanna offer a comment, we're very interested to just understand what brings you here tonight. So if you could just introduce yourself briefly when you make a comment in the breakout room. Sounds like your fellow breakout room members would be very interested to understand who we're sharing the space with.
How do the alternatives consider the loss of land near the bay and increased flooding into the city?
Thanks for raising that. That's definitely part of something that we're going to be looking at in the evaluation to see how these different alternatives would perform when we think about existing and future hazards, including flooding and sea level rise, and how much development might be placed in the path of those various hazards under each one of the alternatives. We don't have that information yet, but that's part of what we're going to be looking at in the evaluation.
Are you tracking none of the above type responses to the 3 alternatives? If we think the study areas are inequitably distributed and should be broadened to include the entire city, this person's asking for a friend.
Okay, well, you can let your friend know that we're very open to that input. And if you have, let me say to be clear that the study areas that we've arrived at, as I hope was explained in the presentation, were arrived at through most of a year of community input process and more than one city council meeting to consider the boundaries of these study areas so that we could kind of know what we were working with for the building blocks of the alternatives. So they have been pretty thoroughly considered at this point. We're not anticipating in this process that there's going to be significant changes to the study areas. But again, that is a decision that ultimately would be made by the council. It's certainly not my decision to make. So we are interested in your input tonight. If that's something you want to share, that you feel that we should be looking at different study areas or different boundaries of the study areas, that is input that you can share in the breakout room.
Next question, who is expected to move into San Mateo? For example, commuters to the Silicon Valley, biotech parks in South San Francisco, etc.
That's another great question and something that I think that evaluation can take a look at in terms of broader future demographic shifts. We also do have some white papers posted on the website. If you want to take a look at those, that's drivesanmateo.org. We did some papers at the outset of the process looking at future job projections, future population projections, and population changes over time.
Will the general plan address zoning in areas that are not in current study areas?
The places, the areas that are inside the study areas are where we think that the general plan land use map is most likely to need to change. So those other areas likely would have their existing general plan designation remain in place. And I do just want to stress again that the general plan designation is general plans different from zoning, and the general plan designations are different from zoning designations, but the general plan designations establish what zoning is possible on a given parcel.
Can the regional housing needs allocation quota be challenged?
If you want to talk about the regional housing needs allocation process, I want to make sure that you're aware of a meeting a week from today on the April 22nd. I do have a slide that I'll share about this with all of these meeting dates, and that is meeting all about RHNA, or the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. That meeting will be a great place to talk about more understanding how we arrived at the allocation we have, whether it can be challenged, and what might be the outcomes of that.
Have the developments at Bay Meadows and along Delaware been included in the study, or are your numbers above what's already developed?
So the numbers are net new numbers for what would be built, but in terms of the approved specific plans, for example, in the Bay Meadows area, that is one of the examples I mentioned earlier of something that's the same across all three alternatives. That's a pretty recent plan that was adopted by the city. It's still valid guidance for that area. So all three alternatives anticipate the future build out of those areas according to the adopted specific plan.
There's a question about how we prioritize feedback of residents and non-residents.
Well, we're gonna see what kind of feedback we get here tonight. And this is, again, one source of input. We're gonna take the input that we hear tonight about the range of ideas. We're gonna consider those ideas based on our professional expertise as consultants and as staff. And we're gonna present those ideas to the general plan subcommittee and to the planning commission and to the city council to seek direction on how the input should be incorporated and reflected in the range of alternatives. And Carrie, I think let's do one more question. And then
that works perfectly because I have one more question.
Awesome.
You mentioned the state requirements and also that the effect of the pandemic has been taken into account. People are leaving the area. Has the state taken this into account?
People are leaving the area. I think it's true that people are leaving the area.
Joanna, you're muted.
Okay, don't know how that happens. Thanks, Allison. Okay, I was just saying that, yes, people are coming to the area, people are leaving the area. I mean, the Bay Area is a very dynamic place, absolutely. I know right now there's a real sense of kind of people fleeing, but I also think that those of us who have lived in the Bay Area for the type of 20-year time frame that this plan is going to cover are very aware that it's a pretty cyclical place. So there may be some population declines right now. There will be population increases in the future. Over a 20-year time frame, I think we're going to see some of both. And that brings us to the end of Q&A. But before we go into the breakout rooms, there has been some questions about kind of like who's here and who are we going to be hearing from and who's going to be offering input tonight. So we do have a couple of polls, one poll, I guess, that we can launch now. And we wanted to give everybody a little bit of time to join. I noticed while I was giving the presentation that we were still having a lot of people coming into the meeting. So seems like we've gotten to a pretty stable set of participants. So I'd like for you to take a look at the poll on your screen. If you're part of the city team, please don't answer any of these questions. But if you're a participant, we'd love to hear from you. Go ahead and look at these questions asking us about whether or not you've been part of a general plan meeting before. How would you describe yourself as a stakeholder? All of these results are going to be visible to all of us. We'd love to know how you heard about today's session. And that really helps us do a better job with our outreach going forward. And then, of course, similarly, we want to make sure that we can keep you informed. So we've got the votes coming in here. I want to give a little bit more time because we haven't heard from everybody yet. And I know we're asking you some kind of detailed questions. So thanks very much for your patience and getting through those. This is really important stuff for us to hear about. When we get about to the 2-minute mark, we'll wait a few more seconds after 2 minutes before we close the poll. Really appreciate the answers that you guys are sharing. This is really helpful to us. And I know that maybe not everybody is able to vote or is interested in responding to these questions. So let's stop there. Lindsay, I think we can go ahead and end the polling. Thank you. So we've heard from 80% of the folks who are attending the meeting tonight. So I'm really excited that almost half of the people are at their first general plan event. That's great. Thank you so much. We're really excited that you're joining us in this process, and I hope that we'll see you at future events as well. So 83% of people define themselves as a resident of San Mateo. 34% of people work here. And of course, with this question, you could provide more than one answer. So people may fit into more than one of these categories. 17% of people own a business. Almost 60% own property. A few people are visit or customers of businesses, represent homeowners, 6% represent homeowners association, 9% represent a neighborhood group, and 11% represent some other organization. So the greatest category of stakeholder are residents and property owners here in San Mateo. How did you learn about today's session? Most people learned from email newsletters, about 59%. Next highest category was social media, followed by the San Mateo Daily Journal ads, and by homeowners association groups or neighborhood groups, also an important source of information. And then 13% of people just heard about word of mouth. So that's great too. Thank you everyone for sharing the word about the general plan update and about these meetings. And it looks like 88% of you would like to keep hearing from us by email newsletters, and also a strong proportion of social media updates and communications through homeowners associations or neighborhood or community groups. With that, I'm going to stop sharing the results. And I hope that that helps to answer some of the questions about who's here and who are the stakeholders that are engaging tonight. So with that, we are going to move into breakout rooms. And remember that for participants, once you get to your breakout room, you don't have to do anything else. Just pay attention to the screen and be engaged, and remember those guidelines for conversation that we talked about earlier. All right, Lindsay, I think we can do it.
So as of right now, no one has messaged me to be in a, or anyone to be in a breakout room for Spanish speakers. So I am just going to put everyone in a group and go from there. All right, accept the notification when it comes in a moment here.
All right, Lindsay, does it look like most folks are back now from the breakout rooms?
Yes, we have all the breakout rooms have closed. Everyone's rejoined us.
Fantastic. Well, before I share my screen again for just 2 closing slides, let me thank you all very much, both facilitators, note takers, all the support staff, and especially residents and citizens of San Mateo who are here with us. But thank you so much. I heard really amazing conversations in the breakout rooms that I visited, and I was really impressed with your thoughtfulness and your attention and your ideas. So thanks so much for that. It makes a huge difference in making this a better plan and a better process. So we noticed that, and we're really grateful for it. I'm going to, as I said, share my screen. Again, just to provide you with a little bit of information briefly about next steps. This is going to be at the very end. So we have the online survey that I mentioned earlier. That's up at least through May 2nd. But again, if we really hear demand for more time, certainly make that happen at strivesanmateo.org if you want to share any other ideas about the alternatives. Anytime you have questions or comments about the general plan process, please contact us at generalplan@cityofsanmateo.org. That email address will reach all the right people who can help answer your questions. We have a whole bunch more upcoming meetings. So this Saturday, we're doing this same meeting again, Saturday morning for folks who prefer Saturdays to weeknights. So if you want to offer additional input, you're welcome to come back. If you have folks you know who you think might want to offer their input, please let them know about the workshop on Saturday morning. Please know that if you do want to join that meeting, you're going to need a new registration link. You can't reuse the same link that you used for this meeting. So if you want to do both, we welcome you, but please do register for both meetings so that you get the Saturday link. Then next week on Thursday is the meeting all about ARENA. That's a county-wide meeting from the Let's Talk Housing folks. RHNA is the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. So if you heard about that tonight and you're curious and you want to learn more or contribute more, please check out that meeting on Thursday, April 22nd. That's not a general plan meeting, but these topics are closely related, of course. Similarly, on Tuesday, May 4th, another meeting about the housing element and introduction to the housing element. That's the third time that meeting will be held. So if you've been to one of the other two, it's going to be that same meeting again. And if you know someone who's looking for an introduction to the housing element, could be a good way to start. That's Tuesday, May 4th. On Monday, May 17th, we're going to be taking a general plan status update to the City Council. So you're welcome to join us there and provide your comments to the council. As always, that is going to be another virtual meeting. And then on Tuesday, May 18th, we have a general plan subcommittee meeting scheduled where we will go through a very similar exercise with them. And we will also share with them the feedback that we've gotten at this Thursday meeting and on Saturday morning's meeting as well. We're going to be looking out to dates with the Planning Commission and the City Council in June and July this summer. And by the time we get to the City Council meeting, our goal will be to ask the council to give us some final direction on refining and finalizing this range of alternatives so that we can launch the next important step of doing the evaluation. And then finally, last but definitely not least, we would really love to know your thoughts about this workshop. We thought really hard about how to put this together for you. I know it was a lot to cover. I really, again, applaud all of you for participating in this and being so willing to share your time with us. And if you have suggestions on what we could do better, we really want to hear that. So if you snap a picture of this QR code with your phone right now, or if you take this link, you will be able to provide us with your feedback, and that's very important to us in doing a good job with our future workshops.
And Joanna, I just want to point out, I also put that link in the chat.
Thank you, Carrie. All right, so Carrie put the link in the chat. You can easily copy and paste it or click on it from there and take a few minutes and give us your feedback. And if you take nothing else away from tonight, which I hope you do, but strivesanmateo.org is your source for the survey, for the information on the alternatives, for those dates and times of all those meetings I listed out, ways of submitting comments to us and sending us emails, and pretty much anything else you'd want to do related to the general plan. So please take full advantage of that. And with that, I think we can let you go, and thank you once again for your time tonight. Thanks so much for being part of this process.
Thanks, everyone.
Just a quick question. The Save Chat, is there a specific place we're supposed to forward to?
Why don't you hang on one sec, Viv?
Okay.
Okay. Well, perhaps we end, and if we feel like we need to regroup, we can do that.